We were talking about Chassidus, and if Chassidus is so spectacular and so amazing and it's so transformative, why is it that people didn't learn it in previous generations? And then we said, well, hang on a second. Actually, if you look at it, when the Torah was originally given, it was actually much more of the mystical. You could see what normally you could only hear, and less so about the practical. So the question is actually the other way around. What happened? What changed? How come at that point in time Judaism was so spiritual and esoteric, and then it kind of seems to have lost that flavor, and it's only very unique groups of people who learn that way? So what we need to know is this. You need to know that there are many sources that will tell you you may not learn certain parts of the Torah. So for example, I'm sure you've heard people say that until a person is 40 years old, you're not supposed to learn Kabbalah. That's one example. You don't learn mysticism until you're 40 years old. Or you have a look, the Rambam writes about the fact that you are not supposed to eat dessert until you've had the main course, which basically means, in his words, you have to fill yourself first with the other dimensions of Torah, and only then you have the rights and the privilege of being able to learn the more spiritual parts of Torah. And in some places are even more severe than that, where they speak directly about the fact, do not delve into Maaseh Merkava, Maaseh Bereshis, the spiritual stories, only teach them to very select people, and so on and so forth. And that's what appears to have been the practice during the course of history, because we had some mishaps. We had some individuals who delved too deeply into the mystical, and it harmed them. For example, the Gemara tells a story that Rabbi Akiva and some of his colleagues went on an excursion into the mystical realms, and Rabbi Akiva was the only one who survived it. The others, it had all kinds of negative effects. So you can look through the course of history and find quite a number of places within Judaism that almost ban us from learning mysticism. So the question is, why? There are two possibilities, and both of those possibilities are rooted in an halachic principle. Once we understand the halachic principle, then we can understand the principle of whether or not we should be learning this information. The halachic principle is this: there are certain things that the Torah says are forbidden. Many things that the Torah says are forbidden. The question is, those things that are forbidden, is it an issue with the item, which we call in the language of Torah, in the language of halacha, we call it an ifsur chefza. That means to say that the item or the entity or the experience is fundamentally forbidden. Or is it an issue with the person, in which case we call it isur gavra, that it's a particular restriction on a particular person. So I'll give you an example. Let's say when it comes to kosher food, chaza is treif, right? Chaza is treif for everybody. There are no exceptions, because it's an isur chefza. There's something about the animal that the Torah considers to be objectionable, and that's it. You can't have it. There are no circumstances under which a person, I shouldn't say no circumstances, because we know that in the case of, God forbid, a life-threatening situation, that might be a different story. But generally speaking, it is still not kosher. Even if you feed it to a person who's deathly ill, that's not because it becomes kosher, it's because they have extenuating circumstances. But let's compare that to, let's say, somebody who dedicates themselves to become a Nazir. So a Nazir, of course, we don't do this nowadays, it's only in the time of the Beis HaMikdash. But effectively, a Nazir is a person who says, I'm going to dedicate myself to Hashem in a whole string of ways. And one of the ways in which I dedicate myself to Hashem is that I don't have any grape product. So now this is an Isur Gavra. This is a restriction on the individual, because the rest of us are allowed to have grapes and wine and grape juice and all that kind of stuff. It's only this person, because of his circumstances, is not allowed to do or have certain things. And there are many, many such examples throughout Torah, right? There's certain things that are across the board forbidden to everybody equally, and there are other things that are depending on the person and their circumstances, and those circumstances might change. So for example, the Nazir commits himself to be a Nazir, let's say for the minimum period is 30 days. So once the 30 days are over, then the same person is now allowed to drink wine. So that's what we have to ask ourselves. When you look back over the course of history and you read all these very important and heavy bans against studying mysticism, you have to ask yourself the question, were those sages telling us that mysticism is treif? Or were they telling us that the people are not in a position to be able to learn it? That makes a big difference, right? Because if you're going to suggest that mysticism is fundamentally treif, then it will never be kosher, and it should not be kosher for anybody, because the product is bad. And yet we see that that's not the case, because at the time of the giving of the Torah, the experience was primarily mystical. And that was for everybody. So there obviously was a time at which it was okay and encouraged and the appropriate thing for everybody to be engaged in mysticism. Then, of course, through the rest of the generations, where there were these unique elite groups of people who studied mysticism, obviously that tells you that it's not treif. It just tells you that those people are at a different caliber. And therefore, those people are allowed to study mysticism because of who they are. There's no problem with what it is. So that's the first thing that we have to consider, is that if there is any restriction that was placed on the studying of mysticism, it was not because there's something wrong with mysticism. It was because either the time wasn't right or the people were not right. So now we're living in a different time for two major reasons. And that brings us to the second point, because one of the big questions that people ask about Chassidus in particular is, one of the fundamental teachings of Chassidus is bittul, that I'm actually nothing, Hashem is everything, and it defeats the ego. And many people are uncomfortable with that, and they say, surely we have to encourage people, and we have to build people up, and surely we should take a very positive attitude. Why is there so much talk of this bittul, to diminish yourself and to weaken yourself in a sense, to make yourself less of an entity? Why? Why is there that focus? So we have to acknowledge that we're living in a period in history, and have been for the last, call it 200, maybe 300 years, that is markedly different from how history was before, for two big reasons. One is a very positive reason, and one is unfortunately a very negative reason. So let's start with the negative reason. The concept of Jewish people who are not religious is a relatively new concept historically. Because if you look at most of Jewish history, you had many Jews who were not educated, but they were committed. They were religious Jews, and they knew very clearly what the parameters are and where they belonged. And all the way through history, those people who turned their back on Judaism turned their back completely, and they joined other movements or they created other movements. But the idea of people who identify as Jewish and are not observant is a relatively new concept, like in the last 2-3 centuries. So that's a new illness, a new spiritual illness. The idea of being Jewish, but then you define for yourself what Judaism is. So you insist on the name, which appropriately, because you deserve the name, but your behavior is, kind of everybody mixes it up and starts to decide, we believe Judaism is about this, and we believe Judaism is about that, and you'll end up discarding the essence of what Judaism is, which is Torah, mitzvahs, and commitment to Hashem. So through the course of history, there have been all kinds of physical diseases that have afflicted society, and generally the medication of all physical diseases has always been strengthen the body as best as you can, and to whatever extent you can, try and fight the disease. But certainly don't fight the body. Don't do that. That's conventional medicine as it's been throughout the generations. Now, in recent times, we've discovered a different way of dealing with a different kind of disease. When we deal with malignancies, how do we do it? We start to destroy the body. Right? Radiation, chemotherapy destroys the body. And most people would say, well, what are you doing over here? Surely the logic of medicine says that if you want to heal a person, you have to actually strengthen the person. So what is this? You're injecting poison into a person's body. You're bombarding them with radiation, which is potentially lethal. What kind of an approach is that? So medicine tells you very clearly that as we evolve and as we understand differently about the nature of new diseases, so we have to take different approaches. And sometimes the approach is you actually have to weaken the body to save the body, ironically. And God forbid, if you had to take a person who has a tumor, which effectively means that the body is producing cells, and now you're going to make the body stronger, you're also going to make the tumor stronger. So you don't have a choice. Your only choice is you have to bombard it to try and break it down. And by the same token, this idea of each person believing that they have the right and they have the knowledge, which is bizarre because people today who claim to speak in the name of Judaism are so patently ignorant. Even people who are leaders of Jewish communities are sometimes so patently ignorant of Judaism that some can't even read properly in Hebrew, and yet become the voice piece and say, I have the right to decide that Judaism is not about this archaic way of living, but it's actually about embracing all kinds of people and bringing everybody under the wings of Judaism, which is very nice and it sounds beautiful, but it's not Judaism. So when you're dealing with this kind of growth within the community of unhealthy cells, we need an approach that helps people to actually break themselves down. That's what Chassidus is there for. And that's why it's dafka at this period in time. The people are different, so we need a different way of helping the people. That's the negative side. But then there's a positive side, and that's really what we should focus on. The positive side is that it's very clear from all of the prophecies about the time of Mashiach, and specifically if you look at the way that the Rambam describes the prophecies of Yeshaya, we understand that the time of Mashiach is specifically a time of great divine revelation. Whatever degree of divine revelation may have happened ever before in history, including at the phenomenal experience of Mount Sinai, it is nothing compared to how much divine revelation will happen in the time of Mashiach, and it will be across the board and it will be for everybody. So when we spoke about standing at the foot of Sinai and seeing what you normally hear, that was just a Vorschweis. That was just a sampling of what it's going to be like when Mashiach comes. When Mashiach comes, 24/7 is going to be to see what you always heard about in all the books. Everything we've learnt about, everything we've heard about, that actually becomes real in the time of Mashiach. Now, it could be quite a dramatic shift if a person has to go from thinking that the here and now is what it's all about to suddenly realizing that God is what it's all about. So Hashem tells us through his representatives, through his great spiritual leaders, he tells us we have to start thinking in that direction now. We've reached a point in history where we have to start training. We have to start opening our eyes to be able to see the world through the lens of how it's going to be like when Mashiach comes already now. And that's why now we start to wholesale teach these mystical principles. And that's why you remember right at the beginning, I said there was a time, and it wasn't so long ago, that people were quite opposed to the concept of learning Chassidus. And now it's become so mainstream, even in societies that are not Chassidic societies, because it's become collective consciousness of the fact that this is actually where we need to be. This is what we need to be focusing on so that we can prime ourselves and prepare ourselves for Mashiach. So when Hashem, as the prophet Yeshaya says, V'nigla kvoid Hashem berol kol basa yachtav, when Hashem will be revealed and all flesh will see Hashem, we'll actually be ready for it. It will be a comfortable transition for us. It will be something that is familiar to us. We will have trained for it, and therefore we'll get maximum benefit. And that's really what we should focus on, is that the fact that this element of Judaism has become so widely revealed now is in itself an indicator that we're living in the time just before the coming of Mashiach. May he reveal himself, and may Hashem reveal himself immediately.